like to know the secret to being more attractive?
Yeah.
The way you talk.
What's that?
The way you talk.
The way you do. How about this? Hang out with ugly people. Because everything from an attractiveness perspective is relative, right? Now, I have to address something that someone mentioned when they saw that written on the board. They said, grow a mustache.
Wonder who could be.
Oh, he's late. They said grow a mustache. There are only two kinds of people in this world who should grow mustaches. Cops and porn stars. You guys aren't cops. Kind of narrows it down. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay, last time we were talking about registered folks, please. Last time we were talking about, oh, I got one more thing. Mr. Warren, were you the one that mentioned about the baby dying?
Yes, sir.
Yes. In a world full of snowflakes and Karens, it takes some real stones to tell the hard truths. And Mr. Warren deserves a coin. Okay, now back to registered versus bearer. If you are not a tax cheater, which do you prefer?
Registered.
Registered. If you are a drug dealer trying to launder money, which do you prefer?
Bearer.
Bearer. Am I telling you to deal drugs or launder money? No. No. Okay. So let's talk about security. Security on a bond is what the lender can take if the borrower doesn't pay. So what's the security on a car loan? A car. What's the security on a mortgage for your house? The house, right? Okay. So you get the general idea here. This first word, collateral, we all talk about that in a general sense, with the car being the collateral for the loan. But for here, it means something more specific. It is a basket of financial securities that the lender can take if the borrower doesn't pay. So it's a basket of financial securities. Now, what kind of financial securities would we see in this basket? Well, they would have to be things that were less risky than the firm's bonds. For example, would you accept the firm's stock as collateral for its bonds? No, why not?
Because the price of the stock will fluctuation.
Okay, let's think this through. When would I get to collect that stock? If,
After everyone else ahead of you gets paid.
say again?
So if the company goes under, you're the last one to get paid.
Yeah, so who gets paid first, the bondholders or the stockholders?
Bondholders.
The bondholders. Would you pass that up to her, please? Thank you. Hey. You've already got 3. People are greedy scumbags. Okay. Yeah, so that's it. I would never accept the stock. Now, I will tell you there's been one exception to this. Do you guys know the company Toys R Us? Yeah. So Toys R Us had a Canadian subsidiary that was going really well. Yes.
We still have one in my city.
You still got one, yeah. And here's, so the Canadian Toys R Us was doing really well. The American Toys R Us held stock in the Canadian Toys R Us and actually put the stock in the Canadian Toys R Us up as collateral for their bonds. Now, when Toys R Us went bankrupt, which they did, then the people who loaned them the money were able to take the stock in the Canadian stores, and we have a witness who says they're still there, right? Okay, but that's the exception, not the rule. Now let's talk about mortgage securities. Mortgage securities are backed by buildings. I mean, we tend to think about houses, but houses are just buildings, right? So you could have a mortgage bond that was backed by a skyscraper. You could have a mortgage bond that was backed by a hotel. So anything that's backed with property would be a mortgage security. And then we have debentures. Debentures are unsecured. Now, this is the first time I've ever gotten to say this and have anybody here who could possibly use this piece of information. Debentures in the United Kingdom have security. So when you guys go home and you hear people talk about debentures there, which I'm sure happens all the time, know that it's not the same thing that we mean with debentures. As far as our exam goes, though, you're in the U.S., this is an American MBA program, debentures are unsecured. Now let's talk about what security would do to the required return on a bond. Which is riskier, a bond where I can take a hotel if they don't pay, or a debenture? Yeah, the debenture's got to be riskier. As a result, which one has to have a higher return? That's got to be the debenture, right? So it's, you know, the signature loans sound great, but they are unsecured, right? And that means that you have to pay a higher interest rate. Now, let's take a little minute. We talked earlier about notes, and we basically just said they're between 1 and 10 years. But here's something else you need to know about notes. They are unsecured. Notes are unsecured. Now, the bonds issued by the United States government, are they secured? No. If we don't pay, can China take California? No. I mean, I wish they could, but that's not the way it works, right? I would easily give away California. Okay, so that's what I'm telling you here is the United States government debt is unsecured. Any questions about security? Yeah.
So would an example of a mortgage security be, I have a friend who started a yoga studio, and they wanted a standalone yoga studio. So they bought the property, but then they put their house as a, like,
Oh, wow.
which is a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that an example of a mortgage security?
I think so.
Okay.
Now, here's what I would ask you guys. Would you put up the place where you sleep as collateral to start a business? No. Now, the next question is this. How would you describe your friend's business acumen?
She built a yoga studio in a very suburban area, so they're doing great.
Oh, good.
It's
Well, I'm glad
next
to
to
hear
the
that.
kids' like soccer place, so the moms drop the kids off to soccer and then
Excellent.
do yoga. So.
So this is an outlier. 95% of small businesses fail in the first year. 95%. Now, how can you improve your potential for succeeding? Go with a franchise. Did she go with a franchise yoga studio? She did her own thing. She is really swimming against the tide. You go, girl. Right? Okay. Other questions? Now let's talk about seniority. How many of you have a job where seniority matters? Oh, wow. What is it? Mr. Ellis, what does your seniority get you in your job?
Well, like my senior director?
No. So the whole concept of seniority, I don't think he knows what I'm talking about. Anybody have a job where your seniority, your time on the job, gets you special stuff?
This is my first year of my GA. I only get paid a certain amount, and then after your first year, you get to ask for an increase. But you also get special privileges.
Special privileges. I like that. Okay, so in fact, in our department, let's see, Ms. Sego, who gets to pick the desk first? The person that's been there the longest or the newbie? Yeah, the person that gets there. And by the way, what do they want the desk furthest away from the door because they want the newbie to have to deal with all the flotsam that flows in through the door, right? Okay, so that's seniority. When I was a grocery stacker, seniority, I got to go to my break first, and I got first pick of vacation, things like that. So that's how we use seniority in employment. Seniority with bonds talks about the order in which you get paid. It talks about the order in which you get paid. And so the senior bondholders get paid first, and then the junior bondholders, and then at the very back of the line, the subordinated debt holders. Now, knowing who gets paid first, which of these would have the lowest yield to maturity?
Senior.
Yeah, senior's going to have the lowest yield to maturity because it is the least risky. And we know risk and reward have to go together. Which one's going to have the highest yield to maturity? Yeah, the subordinated. And remember, I was talking about at the car companies when they went bankrupt, what happened was that the government shuffled those subordinated debt holders to the front of the line in front of the senior debt holders, which is a violation of the rule of law. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually held with the government. And so it's a bad court decision. I hope eventually it gets overturned. But here we go. This is how it works. Now, let's see. Would you prefer any of these over the others in a big diversified portfolio? No, why not? They're all appropriately priced given the risk and the coupons, right? They're all appropriately priced. And so if you buy the junior, yeah, you're going to get a higher return, but you're also taking on more risk. So these things are all appropriately priced given the risk involved. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about repayment. If you think about how a car loan or a house loan works, we said those are amortized loans, and every payment represents two things. What were they? Interest and? Yeah, okay, so loan payments represent interest and principal, right? In a bond, the payments that they make along the way only cover the interest. And so the whole principal is hanging out there at the end. Now, what do you think is riskier? Loaning money to someone where they pay down the principal over time, or loaning money to someone where the whole darn thing is due out at the end? Yeah, the second one, right? The second one. First of all, if they're paying it down over time, at the end, there is a better chance that they'll be able to make that. The other one is that things could go terribly wrong in the meantime, and you could have 30 years out there until you collect your principal. They might not be able to and by the way, how are they going to pay it off? Do you think they've got a big bucket of cash they're going to throw at this thing at the end to pay it off? No, how are they going to pay it off? Where's the cash going to come from? Yeah, they're going to borrow more money. By the way, this is how the United States government works, right? We're like, oh crap, we owe $2 trillion. Phew, let's issue $2.1 trillion in new debt. How long does it work? Right up until it doesn't, right? Right up until people stop saying, ooh, they'll start saying, ooh, I don't want that debt, right? Does that happen to countries? Any Argentinians in here? No. You're from Chile, right?
Yeah.
What happens in Argentina?
In Argentina, they were, I don't remember honestly.
Oh, okay. He's not been paying attention. Chile's in much better shape than Argentina. So Argentina has defaulted on their debt so many times, right? So anyway, I would not loan money to Argentina. That's just me. That's how I roll. Okay, so now without repayment arrangement, what happens? All that principal is paid back at the end, increases the risk. So how am I going to pay back on the bond? Well, we said that the payments don't include principal, so we have to figure out some way to pay down the principal on the bond. And the answer is that we need to repurchase some of those bonds as we go along. And where does the money come from for that? Well, they put money into something called the sinking fund. And this is all going to be laid out in the bond indenture. So the sinking fund, by the way, when we issue new debt, it's called floating it. So we're going to have a flotation. What's the opposite of floating? Sinking. Sinking is the opposite of floating. Therefore, the fund that we use to buy back these bonds is called the sinking fund. And I plan to, I'm the bond issuer, I plan to pay back this money over time instead of all at once at the end. So what do? I write into the terms of the indenture that I will put this much money in a sinking fund every year to repurchase a certain proportion of the debt every year. Now when I do that, as a result, I'm reducing the risk for the borrowers. How are they going to reward me? They're either, well, they may buy more of my debt, but they will not demand as much return, right? So because I'm making it less risky for them, they're not going to demand as much return. That's going to lower my borrowing costs. That's going to lower my borrowing costs. Now, two ways that bonds can be repurchased. If they're publicly traded, by the way, there are some bonds that are publicly traded out there just like stocks. And I could go into my Charles Schwab account and I could actually go out and buy or sell those bonds. And so if it's one of those kind of bonds, then all you've got to do is go out in the public market and buy them back. But if not, if they are bonds that are not publicly traded, then you have to use what's called a call provision. And we'll discuss the call provision. But it's basically where I can force you to sell me bonds back. I saw an article in our local newspaper. The Ozark School District issued some bonds, and then they figured out they didn't need all the money to do the thing that they were supposed to be doing with the money. In other words, their project came in under budget. So they've got $5 million left. Who does that money actually belong to? The taxpayers. And wouldn't it have been better to have used that extra $5 million to buy back those bonds and lower that interest that they're paying every 6 months? Instead, what are they doing? They're having meetings to figure out how to spend the extra $5 million. That's your government, right? That's the agency problem. People spend other people's money differently than they spend their own. Okay, so we talked about it reduces the risk of the bond issue, and I think our bondholders, I think we understand why. I'm going to give you one more example of this. My cousin Harry, I went to see, by the way, my cousin Harry spent a lot of time in the Navy because he knew if he got outside in the civilian world, he'd probably end up in prison. So that's my cousin. And so he bought this house in Kansas City, and I went and saw it, and I'm like, Harry, this is a sweet house. He's like, thanks. And I said, how in the world can you afford this? Because in my family, we're really, blunt about things. I said, how can you afford this? He says, I got this great mortgage. I'm like, what's the great mortgage? He says, well, for the first 15 years, all I do is pay the interest. And he says, and then I've got this thing called the balloon payment. Yeah, this thing called the balloon payment at the end. I'm like, oh, Harry, that sounds fine, but what are you going to do 15 years from now? He's like, I don't know. 15 years roll past. What do you think happened? Yeah, Harry doesn't own the house anymore, right? Yeah, one night the phone rang. It was my cousin Harry. He's in a jail down in Mexico. And he'd been caught with a gun, which that's Harry. Okay, so getting caught, right? Okay, so then he calls, and my dad's like, call your cousin Junior, and hangs up. And so then we hear from Junior later on that Junior had to drive down there with a bag of money and hand it over to get Harry out of jail. Harry never did get his gun back. So there's your if in case you're ever in a Mexican prison, the answer is get someone to come down with a bag full of money, right? See, you get all sorts of useful information in this class. Okay, back to the story. I'm going to have to edit that out of the video. Okay, so back to the story. It's riskier for the lender if you've got this big amount of money hanging out at the end. That's why the sinking fund reduces the risk. So let's talk about the call provision. The call provision gives the issuer, that's the borrower, the right but not the obligation to repurchase the bond at a set amount, and the amount over is called the call premium, above the face value. So let's say the bonds are out there trading at, and by the way, it's usually one set of coupons is the amount of the premium, but it's all spelled out in the indenture. And so let's say that the premium is 40. If I want to buy back that bond from you, I'm going to have to pay you $1,040 for every bond that's out there. Now, assume the bonds are only worth $1,010 at present. Am I going to use the call provision? No, man. I can get your bond. I can buy it on the open market for $1,010, right? No reason for me to use the call provision. When is the call provision going to be valuable? When the bond price is greater than the face value plus the call premium. Now at this point, you're sitting there feeling pretty good. You've got a bond that's worth $1,050. and you get a letter in the mail one day, and the letter has a check attached to it, and for every bond that you have with that company, they are now paying you $1,040, and they say, we've called your bonds, have a nice life. Now, what kind of situation leads to bond prices going up? What's going up? What's going on with yield to maturity in the market? Yeah, it's going down, right? Because this is the relationship. Now, what this means is that you've got this big chunk of money to reinvest at the worst possible time. Remember, we talked about reinvestment risk being the risk that you may have to reinvest at a lower rate. Well, if these bonds were selling at 1,000 when you invested and now they're worth 1,050, then that means yield to maturity has gone down, and when you go to reinvest that money, you're going to reinvest at an even lower rate. Now, that means it is riskier for you as a bond holder to have these bonds. As a result, what are you going to demand yield to maturity wise? And you're going to demand higher return, right? Now, here is a sad, sad story. This is a true story from the Wall Street Journal. There were some little old ladies, and these little old ladies all lived in Florida, and their husbands were dead. And that's not the sad part. Their husbands were dead. I don't know, he could have been a bad man, right? Okay, so they're living down there, and how are these little old ladies living in Florida? Well, they're Social Security, but mainly they're living off of the coupons, off of bonds. And these bonds were bought about 1981 when interest rates were high, so coupon rates on bonds were high. And so the little old ladies were living high off the hog. They were having a good time. And then 2001 rolls around. We have the terrorist activity, and it crashes the economy. And in order to stimulate the economy, they drop interest rates like crazy. And so these little old ladies, their bonds mature, they collect the money, and they go to their local broker, and they say, well, our bonds, which had 12% coupons, we need to replace those. And the broker says, no problem. I can give you a bond from the same company with a 6% coupon. And the little old ladies are like, oh, that's half, right? How would you like your non-Social Security income to drop by half? Oh man, the little old ladies are like, oh no, that's terrible. So what do? They say, isn't there anything you can do to get us higher coupons? And he says, well, we do have these other bonds that yield a little bit more. And they're like, well, 6.5% is better than 6%, so we'll go ahead and take those. And so they take the 6.5%. And then 2 years later, some more crap happens. Interest rates drop even lower, and the little old ladies get these letters in the mail along with checks saying your bonds have been called, here's your money, have a nice life. The little old ladies are confused. And so they hop in the Buick, because it's a Buick, right? They hop in the Buick and they hot rod 25 mile an hour down to the broker's office. And they're like, what's up? And he says, oh yeah, those bonds you bought were callable bonds. That's why they paid the higher interest rate. If you had read the prospectus like I told you to, by the way, who reads the prospectus? Apparently not little old ladies, right? If you read the prospectus, if you read it like I told you to, you would know that. You would know that there was this risk that you're going to be called out. Well, now the little old ladies have to reinvest their money at even a lower interest rate. So now they're looking at something like 4% coupons. And so now they're making 1/3 of what they used to. The final nail in this, the last line of this whole story was, things are so bad now that I can only eat at the country club once per week. Isn't that terrible? By the way, what's the purpose of a country club?
Rich people eating.
Rich people eating.
So stay away from
And why do rich people want to go to the country club?
Stay away from
Stay away from poor people. Very good. I'm glad you figured that out. I had a friend that asked me what country club I would recommend. I said, I don't know. No one would have me as a member. Okay, so now let's move on to protect the covenants. By the way, the stuff that I want to put into a bond indenture, because remember, it's the borrower that writes the contract, right? The kind of stuff that I want to put in there is stuff that's going to lower the risk for the bondholder, so they will require a lower yield to maturity, so I can put smaller coupons on my bonds and still sell them at face value. And every additional protective covenant I can put onto the bond will lower the risk and therefore hopefully lower my borrowing cost. Now, what sorts of things would I put in there? Well, if it's one of these positive covenants, which we'll get to this in a minute, it'll be things that I plan to do anyway. And if it's a negative covenant, it's things I don't plan to do anyway. And so by promising to do or not to do these things, I can reduce the risk of the bond to the bondholder and therefore lower my cost of borrowing. So, what's a negative covenant? It's something that says what the issuer is not allowed to do. To use biblical language, it's the thou shalt not, right? Thou shalt not do this stuff. Positive covenants say what the issuer must do. These are the thou shalts. So let's give some examples here. By the way, I'm going to give you examples. Not every bond has every covenant I'm going to talk to you about. This is like the buffet, right? There are all these covenants at the salad bar. I can go around and choose the covenants that I, the borrower, want and leave the others there. Because some of these might actually be antithetical to the business model of the company, but we'll get to that. So, negative covenants. First of all, the firm must limit dividend payments. Now, let's talk about why, as a bondholder, you would not want the company paying out huge dividends. Any ideas?
You'd rather them pay you back?
What's that?
You'd rather them pay you back?
You'd rather them pay you back. And so what does it take to get paid back? What have they got to have to pay you back?
Like profits?
Cash. And what do they need? What happens to cash when they pay dividends?
Leaves.
Yeah, leaves. And so if they pay more dividends, chances of paying you back are less. This deserves a coin.
I go through this.
Oh, okay, there you go. Okay, so that's why. Here, and let me give it to you in the worst possible way. If I wanted to rip you guys off, here's what I would do. I would sell you bonds that don't have that covenant in it. I would immediately take that money, pay it out as a dividend to the shareholders. By the way, what's my job? Maximize shareholder wealth. Pay it out to the shareholders, and then say, whoop, sorry, and declare bankruptcy. Is that a scumbag move?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you think this is a useful covenant then? Now look, folks, I promise I'm not going to scumbag you like that. And that's going to make the risk lower, and so you're going to demand a lower yield to maturity. Now, firms cannot pledge assets to other lenders. And so if the bond is backed by the assets of the firm, and then I go off and, say, pledge a factory to another lender, they're going to have seniority over that asset in bankruptcy because you're just the general assets, right? So that's going to go away. And so if I'm going to do this, I want to say, look, I'm not going to pledge, I'll not use these assets to borrow additional money. Now, let me explain to you why that is the way it is. I've got this house, and according to Zillow, it's worth like $450,000, which is nuts. Anyway, but it's $450,000, and I come to you, and I say, Ms. Wen, would you loan me $250,000 against this $450,000 house? No. She assumes I'm a scumbag because she knows me personally. Let's assume you don't know me personally. In general, would you loan $250,000 with $450,000 collateral?
Maybe.
Maybe. Oh my goodness, you're a tough cookie.
Yes.
Okay, well, so I'm going to go to Becca here. What? Will you loan me the money?
Sure, I'll loan.
Yeah, there you go. And then I'm going to come down here. Now, keep in mind, I just got $250,000 of her dollars. And then Ms. Holden. Ms. Holden, would you loan me $250,000 against this house? You didn't hear that, by the way.
No.
She also knows I'm a scumbag. Yeah, Mr. Tips, well, he knows them. Yeah, we're good. And then, I'm not going to ask you. He's giving me Miss Sifa, would you loan me the money? Absolutely. Okay, so now I've got $250 from you, $250 from you, and $250 from you, right? Now, what do you think's going to happen next?
You're gonna go bankrupt?
I'm going to go bankrupt. And then, here's what's going to happen. Yeah. So, she shows up at the house, right? She's there for clothes. And while she's standing there, Mr. Tips shows up. And she says, who the hell are you? And he says, I'm Mr. Tips. And she says, what the hell are you doing here? He says, I'm here to claim my house. She's like, back off. It's my house. And then Miss Eva shows up. And she's like, what are you two doing on my porch? What do you mean, my porch? And then a three-way fight ensues. I don't know if you've ever seen a three-way fight, but this is what it looks like, right? Okay. When you're loaning money out, do you really want to be signing up for a fight? No. I don't want to have to fight other people in the bankruptcy courts to get my money here. And so that's why we're going to put this in there. In fact, I have a friend who worked for a company called Calpine, and they got in trouble this way because they had loans against their general assets with a covenant that said that they wouldn't pledge assets. And in fact, and they didn't just not, then they borrowed money against these two power plants with the power plants as collateral, and they failed to make the payments. And so those people show up to take the power plants, and then the original bondholder's like, whoa! And so there was a big old lawsuit, and Calpine ends up going out of business, and my buddy did not go to jail. He was able to move to another company, but these things happen. Okay, questions so far?
Don't banks verify that your asset isn't collateral anywhere else?
I want you to go out tonight and search mortgage fraud. And you will see, and I'm not telling you to get into this business at all, but you'll see that if people are clever and they time things just right, they can pull this stuff off.
Is there laws against you doing it as a person?
Oh, hell yes. Oh yeah, these people are living high off the hog right up until everything hits the fan. So here's the full plan. You do the mortgage fraud, you get the money, and before anyone figures out what's going on, which is when the first payment's due, right? You go out and you buy a bunch of bearer bonds. And you move to Mexico. And then you wait, right? Am I telling you how to commit crimes? Yes. Am I telling you to commit crimes? No. Okay. So here's a good one. Firms cannot merge with another firm. Remember I told you that some of these would be absolutely, you couldn't do them based on the firm's business model. If you look at big firms in the US, mergers are a fairly common occurrence. And you look at Apple. Apple tends to buy up small companies. Other companies tend to, like airlines, merge big airline with big airline. Why would you not want someone to merge with another firm? It comes down to risk. Let's assume that I've got a business where it's a dairy. You guys know what a dairy is, where you get milk from cows? And I've got a contract with the Springfield Public Schools promising me to pay me 10% over my cost in order to deliver milk to the schools. In other words, it's basically a can't lose deal, right? And I'm going to put in a chocolate milk line because everybody knows kids like chocolate milk. Well, where am I going to get the money? Well, I go out and I sell this half of the class bonds. And you guys say, well, that's really safe. I'm going to, 4% is plenty good for that. Now, my brother-in-law, on the other hand, has a business cleaning up radioactive disasters. Like when Fukushima and all that, and Chernobyl, things like that. That's his business. Now, is that a riskier business? Yeah. He's going to sell a bond to the people on this side of the room. What are you guys going to require for a yield to maturity on those bonds? Is it going to be 4%? No, let's say it's 8%, right? 8%. Now, my brother-in-law, over Thanksgiving, we're enjoying some dry turkey, and he says, hey, what would you think about merging our firms? I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Because we could get rid of one CFO, we could get one CIO, we could get rid of a lot of people that way, right? We could cut it with one headquarters. That's a great idea. Let's merge our companies. Now, we merge our companies. By the way, they're equal size. These are 2 companies. Now, the company is of average risk between those 2 things. So it's not really safe, it's not really risky, it's somewhere in the middle. And as a result, people now require 6% yield to maturity on our bonds. Now, you guys are thrilled. Why are you thrilled? You had bonds with, so I'm assuming that we sell these things at face value. Your bonds have 8% coupons. Now the yield is 6%. How would we describe your bonds now?
Additional.
Say again?
Additional both together.
Yeah, less risky.
Okay. Oh no, it's not principal.
Less risky.
It's a premium bond, right? So because the risk of the bond goes down, the yield to maturity has gone down, so the price goes up. So you guys, now instead of having a bond that was worth $1,000, you've got a bond that's worth $1,050. Are you thrilled? Yeah! Now let's talk to some people who are really mad. You guys have bonds with 4% coupons, and now the yield to maturity is 6%. Your bonds are currently selling for $950, because remember, yield to maturity for you went up, so your price went down. Do you see how that works? It's a wealth transfer. It's a straight wealth transfer from the bondholders of the risky firm to the from the bondholders of the risky firm to the bondholders of the safe firm. Now, people like wealth transfers when they're on the positive end of them, and they hate them when they're on the negative. So what kind of companies would probably put this in here? How about safe ones? Safe ones with no intention to merge with anybody would go ahead and put this in there to assure their bondholders that they were not going to pull this scumbaggy move. Okay, now let's talk about not being able to sell or lease major assets without lender approval. So you have loaned me money based on the entirety of the assets, and then I go out and sell something, I take the cash and I pay out a dividend. Now things get tough. What does that do to the amount of money that you're going to be able to get back from me in bankruptcy? It's going to reduce it, right? And so if I don't have any intention of doing these things, then I will go ahead and put it in the covenants so you don't have to worry about it, and so I'll get the lower yield of maturity that goes along with that. Now this last one is one that is seldom seen, and that is because companies issue, especially big companies, issue new long-term debt all the time. And especially they're using new long-term debt to pay off old long-term debt. But here's the reason that if you did not plan to issue additional long-term debt, it would be good to put it in there. Who would you rather loan money to? Someone who doesn't owe money to everyone else, or someone who does owe money to someone else? Yeah, someone who doesn't, right? And so when you first loan me money, you say, well, who else do you owe money to? And I say, nobody. And you guys are all like, oh, okay, well, it's a fairly safe bet. I'll only require 5% yield to maturity. Well, then I go out and borrow money from other people too. Well, now I've got additional fixed payments. My cash is going to be lower. The probability of financial distress for my firm is going to be higher, right? And so if you can get by with it, you would like to include this one because you are basically saying, I'm not going to issue more debt beyond this, therefore you can give me the lower required return. Questions?
Are there any provisions, I guess, from selling out your firm as a whole, or just selling it to someone else, not merging?
Okay, so the merger thing, and when we get to chapter 21, you'll see that a lot of times an acquisition, so for an acquisition to happen, there has to be a sale happen, right? And how do we put those two companies together? A merger, right? And so if you have this provision that says you're not going to merge, basically prevents you from being able to sell the firm without paying the debt off first. Questions? That's a good question, thank you. Now let's talk about positive covenants. First of all, the firm must maintain the net working capital at or above a stated minimum level. Can anyone tell me what net working capital is? What's the formula? Current assets minus current liabilities. Current assets are things we expect to produce cash within 1 year. Current liabilities are things we expect to consume cash within 1 year, right? And so we want to have more current assets than current liabilities. And by the way, cash is one of those current assets. Why do I want them to maintain their net working capital at a certain level?
So they can pay you back.
Yeah, first of all, I want them to be able to pay back my coupons. But let's assume that they paid back the coupons, but they didn't have enough money to pay off their suppliers. What's going to happen? Yeah, okay, so the first step is the suppliers say, wait a minute. And by the way, the suppliers are selling on credit, right? And so then they start saying, wait a minute, we're not going to ship you any more stuff until you pay. And by the way, eventually the suppliers can push the firm into bankruptcy. Let me give you an example of this situation. So Bed Bath & Beyond, you guys are probably old enough to know about it. Before Bed Bath & Beyond, they had a competitor, Linens and Things. And Linens and Things, that's a true story. She's laughing like I'm pulling her leg, but it's true. Okay, so Linens and Things, not sure what the things were, but the linens were even the things like towels and sheets. And anyway, but the problem is they got into some trouble and they couldn't pay their suppliers. And so the suppliers said, hey, yeah, we'll be glad to send you more towels and sheets and things if you'll send us a check. Well, hey, they didn't even have the cash to pay off what they already owed. They certainly don't have enough cash to go out and buy new supplies. And so what starts to happen to the inventory on the shelves? Yeah, it starts to go down. Now, the good stuff goes first, so what are they left with? Yeah, the cream of the crap, right? And so eventually, though, that basically, it kills the firm, and the firm goes bankrupt. It was the suppliers that pushed them into bankruptcy. But who ends up also getting burnt? The long-term debt holders, right? The bond holders. And so if I am going to, if I throw this in there, then it helps to give people the assurance that I'm going to pay my suppliers, that they're not going to push the company into bankruptcy, and they'll also have enough money to pay their coupons. Now, how do I know if they're actually doing that? Well, I have to have their financial statements. And not only do I want financial statements, I want audited financial statements. So, where are our, let's see, Ms. Wainaina, what is an audited financial statement? What does that mean?
It's a financial statement that has been, I don't know what to call it, audited. Just going through the financial statements to ensure that they portray a true picture of the financials.
Very good. So it's been looked at by a third party, an accounting company, right? Now, audited financial statements are more likely to be truthful than unaudited financial statements. So I have an acquaintance who is a business broker, and people come to him wanting to sell their businesses, and they show him their financial statements. And he says, are these financial statements audited? And they're like, no, we can't afford an accountant. And then he's like, oh. He says, okay, no problem. Show me your tax returns. Why are the tax returns more likely to be accurate than the financial statements they're trying to use to sell their firm?
To see if they lie.
Say again?
To see if they lie.
Yeah, why would they lie to the broker but maybe not to the government? Yeah, nobody wants to go to jail. If you know someone that wants to go to jail, there's something wrong with them, right? Or maybe they have a terminal illness and they need medical care. We did have a guy here locally that tried to rob a bank so he could, and in fact, there was a guy that robbed a bank so he could go to prison to get away from his wife. And the judge sentenced him to home confinement. That is a true story. Look that up. Okay. So, this is why the tax documents are more believable. So if anyone's wanting you to loan money to their small business, look at their tax documents, don't look at their financial statements. Now, does being audited mean that they are 100% accurate? No. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. And I'll give you an example from my own work experience. The year is 1997. It's getting toward the end of the year. I am a production group leader at a factory in Texas. And I see this young man. He's just like 2 or 3 years younger than me. He's coming through the shop, and he's wearing a suit, a tie, and he's got on shiny shoes. And he's got his safety glasses on, but other than that, you can tell he way does not belong there. And so I'm watching this guy, and I see one of the warehouse people trot up to him. And he says, "Are you the accountant?" And the young man says, "Why, yes, I am the accountant." And the warehouseman says, "I've got something that you might find interesting." And the accountant says, "What?" He said, "These people have all sorts of inventory on the back dock that they're not receiving into their inventory until after the first of the year because they're trying to make their inventory look lower." And the warehouseman says, "Is that a problem?" And the accountant says, "Why, yes, that is. Show me this inventory." And so the young man and the warehouseman trot off together to the warehouse, and because, I'm a supervisor and don't really have anywhere else to be, my guys were behaving themselves. So I follow these people, and sure enough, there's this freaking mountain of inventory. Now, this is before the days of cameras on phones, so this guy had one of those disposable cameras here, and he's like taking pictures. And then he walks back out to the middle of the shop floor, and he pulls his huge phone out of his pocket, because they were big back then, and he calls. He makes several calls. And the last call I hear him make is to the guy that's managing the audit there at our location. And the guy that's managing the audit, he says to him, "I've spotted all this inventory that hasn't been put in here." And the guy that's the site manager says, "Not going to worry about it. It's probably just an oversight for this location." He says, "No." He says, "I've called their facilities in Houston, New Iberia, Louisiana, Montrose, Scotland, Angola. It's the same everywhere. These people are holding off letting in their inventory to make their inventory look better." And the managing director at the site says, and I'm guessing this is what he says, "Yeah, this is an issue. I'll bring it up." And so he calls down to the Arthur Anderson, by the way, it was Arthur Anderson, office in Houston, the same people that brought you in, Ron, calls them, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sure it's not a problem." And he tells them, and he's like, yeah, it kind of is. And so then when the head guy from the Arthur Anderson office goes to visit with the audit committee at Halliburton, he says, "This is going on. And by the way, it has to be material for it to matter." What does material mean?
Not true.
Say again?
It's not true.
Yeah, substantial. It has to be something the investors would want to know about. They don't want to know if you've wasted $1.68 on chewing gum, but several million, in this case, almost $1 billion worth of inventory. That's material. Now, so the guy goes over to the audit committee there at our Houston headquarters and says, "By the way, your people aren't bringing inventory in." And the audit committee says, "Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention." By the way, I wasn't there for this part, so I'm just imagining what happened. "Thank you for bringing this to attention." "Well, you're welcome. Oh, by the way, we're thinking about hiring a new auditor. Do you have any recommendations?" Do you see how this works? Who's paying for the audit? Yeah, the company, right? And so when the auditor has to choose between serving the bondholders and the shareholders with a truthful report or keeping their job, what do they tend to choose?
Their job.
Yeah, their job. And so keep in mind that an audited financial statement does not necessarily mean that it's 100% accurate. It doesn't even mean that it's materially accurate. In fact, usually what an audit firm will do, instead of saying, "These bastards are dirty" in their report, what they will do is they will resign. If it's really, really bad, They'll just say, we're no longer going to be auditing the books of this company. When an auditor makes an announcement like that, what signal should it be to you?
Sell your stocks, get out.
Yeah, sell your stocks and get out, right? Because things are rotten in Denmark. Questions?
Were they just doing that to more or less pad their Q1, like financial?
Oh, so he's asking why. And there's very easy rationale. The bosses got rewarded on inventory turns hitting a certain level. And so if I can make the inventory look lower, but the cost of goods sold are the same, what does that do to inventory turns? And then, of course, on January 1st, oh my goodness, our inventory turns went straight to hell. We would do this every year. The exercise was called draining the swamp. And there's nothing wrong with selling down your inventory. That's not illegal. But this crap of holding off, bringing it on, putting it on your books, that was illegal. Good question. Other questions? Are people scumbags? Yes. Go ahead.
What other options are there for companies in addition to the audited financial statements? So if a company wants to be safe, so there's the audited financial statements and what else?
As far as what you can get to look at, the audited financial statements are the best documents you can get. Typically, big companies are not going to give you their tax returns, right? So this is small business where you get the tax returns from them. The best thing to do, by the way, a lot of times the footnotes in financial statements are actually where you're going to find the problems. So you can use earnings management and whatnot to kind of massage the numbers otherwise, but when you look down in the footnotes, you start to see some hinky stuff. I'm sorry, there's not really anything better, though, than looking at what they give you. It's sad. But you are forewarned, therefore you are forearmed. When you are doing business with these people, you are always going to take their accounting financial statements with a grain of salt. You are always going to require additional yield to maturity to reward you for carrying the risk that they are lying to you. Does that make sense? Okay. Firm must maintain any collateral or security in good condition. Why would I want them to maintain, let's say it's a factory. Why would I want them to maintain that factory in good condition? Yeah, to keep its value. If they don't pay, then I get to take over the factory. Do I want to take over a factory in good condition or a crap factory?
Good.
A good condition, unless it's a factory that actually makes crap, which I think we call horses, right? Then I want it to be in good condition because what am I going to do with it?
Sell it.
Yeah, I'm going to sell it and I want to get the most value that I possibly can out of it. So my wife worked at a credit union and they were always having to repossess people's cars. Cars that get repossessed, do you think people have taken really good care of them? No. And by the way, as soon as they figure out that they're not going to be able to make the payments, do they take them for oil changes anymore? No. Do they drive gently away from stoplights? No. Do they slam on the brakes? Yeah. Are they doing donuts in the Walmart parking lot? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. They're not doing it at Target. Those people are a little bit higher class. Walmart. By the way, I shop at Walmart too, right? Okay. So that's why we want people to maintain this in good condition. Now, let's talk about how are we going to verify that? Well, we could have the bond trustee, which is a third party that is kind of watching this whole thing, and they are the ones that are holding the sinking funds. We could have them send in a third-party inspector to make sure that the facility is being maintained in accordance with the engineering, the instructions left by the engineering firm to build the factory, something like that. Okay, now let's move on to bond ratings. Now, notice I've got the word supposedly. They supposedly represent a combination of default risk and probability of recovery given in default. I think your book only talks about default risk, but the bond rating actually includes not only default risk, but the probability of recovery given default. Let's talk about what that means. For instance, a debenture. You've got a debenture from the same company. You've got a debenture and a mortgage bond. The mortgage bond is backed by the company headquarters. The debenture is backed by what? Nothing, right? Now, which one of those has a higher probability of you getting your money back if they do default? Yeah, the mortgage bond does. And so even though both of these bonds have exactly the same risk of default, the mortgage bond has the higher probability of recovery given default, therefore it will have a higher bond rating. This is how you end up with bonds from the same company having different ratings. And that probability of recovery given default, maybe you're using collateral, maybe it's the covenants, who knows. But you can end up with different bond ratings for bonds from the same company. Now, who is issuing these ratings? Well, the two big ones are S&P and Moody's, and then the perennial third runner, maybe the Chrysler of the bond rating world, is Fitch. I mean, Fitch even sounds bad, right? Now, what do these people do? In theory, here's what these people do. They look at your financial statements and they look at your industry and they figure out how risky lending you this money is. It's kind of like the credit score that you guys all have. And so they are supposed to issue this rating. Now, here's the problem. If you're a big company, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch will always rate your bonds. That's not the problem. And so there are no incentives for S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. But what if you're a smaller company? Well, then you may have to pay one of these firms to rate your bonds. Let's talk about why you might want to pay someone to rate your bonds. Example, I have a friend, Janet, and Janet used to be in charge of Treasury at City Utilities here in Springfield. And when they were getting ready to add a unit onto that Southwest power plant that's out west of town, they had to borrow some money to do it. So they're going to issue a bunch of bonds. And so Janet is talking to the investment banker. That's the person that's going to help her sell these bonds. And he says, you should probably get someone to rate these bonds. And Janet says, why would I pay someone to rate these bonds? And here's the answer. How many people worldwide do you think know about City Utilities in Springfield, Missouri? Well, there's like us, right? But that's about it. So the pond of people willing to invest would be pretty small. But if I can get one of these big three rating agencies to put good ratings on the bonds, then that opens up them to be sold everywhere. Now, if I'm opening up the pool of people that I can sell the bond to, chances are I'll be able to find people who would buy them for a lower coupon rate, so my borrowing costs would be lower. And so what you're trading off here is the cost of getting your bonds rated versus how much you're going to save on your borrowing costs. And if the cost of getting the bonds rated is less than what you're going to save, then you go for it. So S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, let's say that they bid for the business. When I am coming around, so Mr. Tibbs is S&P, and I say, what kind of rating would you give my bonds?
B.
B. He's telling me B. Whoop! What kind of ratings would you give my bonds?
A.
A! She's in the running. What kind of rating would you give my bonds?
A plus.
A plus. Okay, now Mr. Tips is out of business because he was way too honest. Now, between you two, I'm going to say, how much are you going to charge me to rate my bonds?
Like $500.
Oh, no. So when anyone asks you, what are you going to charge me to do something, your first offer always needs to be $250,000. And then you see where they go from there, right? So throw me $250,000.
Okay.
And then I'm going to come to you, say, how much are you going to?
What's the other guy give you? Can I go lower?
You could go lower, but here's the question. Does she actually have to go lower? No, because she's already told me she's going to
Oh,
give
they're
me.
the same. I could give you a
Yeah.
better rate. I'll
In
pay
fact, you might be able to charge me
a little higher.
more.
Yeah.
Okay, now do you see what the incentive is for the bond rating companies.
Give them a better rating.
You give them a better rating and you can charge them more, right? Does that make sense? Is that good? People are scumbags. Let me show you exactly how big of scumbags these people were. During the financial crisis, we had these mortgage-backed securities. And when they would take these mortgage-backed securities to the rating agencies to rate them, they would always rate them AAA, which is the highest possible bond rating. And they would sell. And they would sell at a reasonable yield, to reasonable coupons, reasonable yield to maturity. Well, then when everything went straight to hell, and these bonds got to be worth damn near zero, there's a congressional hearing. S&P, Moody's, and Fitch all show up, and they've gotten sworn in, and in their congressional testimony, they say, yeah, we had no idea to actually, we had no tools to actually measure the risk of those things. They all said that. Now, if I've got no tools to actually measure the risk of them, should I be issuing any rating at all? No. And I for damn sure shouldn't be putting a AAA on them. Why were they doing it? Yeah, those people were. Oh, and by the way, the bond rating agencies were making record profits during that time frame. Now, who gets hurt? How about the pension funds that are allowed to only buy these investment grade bonds? They bought this crap. And so a lot of pension funds got hit. A lot of people who thought they were making safe investments got hit. Now, here's the interesting thing. How many of those three bond rating, they're all guilty. How many of them got actually chased down by the U.S. government?
None.
Only one. Only S&P. And why? Because S&P had the stones to downgrade United States government debt from AAA down to AAA minus or whatever. The next, oh yeah. And then they're like, well, S&P, they were scumbags during the, when they started an investigation. I'm like, well, why don't you investigate these other people? By the way, do you think the government deserved the bond downgrade? Yeah, have you been following the news that's coming out about how our government spends money? Oh my goodness. The difference between our government and drunken sailors and how they spend money? Drunken sailors stop when they run out of money, right? Okay, now, so let's talk about the ratings tiers. There's basically two big tiers you need to know about. And that is investment grade, and then one down below. We'll talk about it here in a little bit. Investment grade bonds are ones that everyone is allowed to invest in. Investment grade bonds are ones that everyone is allowed to invest in. For example, pension funds, university endowments, charitable foundations are all allowed to invest in these investment grade bonds. But they are not allowed to invest in the stuff that we've got down below, which are called junk bonds. Junk bonds. Now, in the beginning, by the way, junk bonds, we're going to show you where the break over here is, but I'll give you a little history of junk bonds. In the beginning, junk bonds they started out life as investment grade bonds, and then things went badly for the borrower. And so these original bonds were called fallen angels. These junk bonds were called fallen angels because they had started out being investment grade, but then, they made some bad choices in their life. They fell in with the wrong crowd, and now they've got crappy bond ratings, and those are fallen angels. But then a guy in the 1980s named Michael Milken comes along, and Michael Milken says, people will buy bonds that are junk bonds. We could actually issue bonds that were original issue junk. They were junk on the day they were born. And what this did was open up borrowing to a whole lot more companies. And so if you were a little too risky to be able to have investment grade rating on your bonds, you could do original issue junk and you could raise the funds. Now the interest rate was high because of risky, right? But you could go ahead and do that. There's only one problem, and that is the name of junk bonds. Does junk sound good to you? No, junk bonds, that just sounds bad. And so they went to the marketing people. And they said, marketing people, we want a name for these bonds. And the marketing people said, well, tell me about these bonds. Well, these bonds are extraordinarily risky. They are bonds, and we call them junk bonds because they are just really risky, and therefore people aren't all that interested in owning them. And the marketing people are like, well, I'm not seeing anything here to work with. Can you tell me something more about these bonds? And Michael Milken says, yeah, these bonds are so risky that they have to have incredibly high yields. Woo! Now the marketing people, here's something they can work with. Let's don't call these junk bonds, let's call them high yield bonds. Doesn't that sound better? Ooh, wouldn't you rather tell your friends you just bought a high yield bond and I just bought a junk bond? Okay. So what that did is allowed, and the big merger wave of the 1980s was as a result of these original issue junk bonds becoming available. So let's talk about the different bond ratings. Let's start with S&P. And you've got big A, big A, big A, and then, by the way, these all have pluses and minuses, except for there's no big A plus. It's like our no A plus, right? So there's big A, big A, big A, big A, big A minus, big A plus, big A, big A, big A, big A minus, A plus, A minus, and so forth, right? And it turns out that we've got Moody's, and they start out with big A, little a, which is the same as big A, big A, big A. Then they've got big A, little a, which is the same as big A, big A. And then A and A are exactly the same. Everybody agrees, by the way, that these are exactly the same. Now we get down to B, and S&P has big B, big B, big B. And you look over at Moody's, and you're expecting big B, little b, little b. Nah. Big B, little a, little a. Sounds like a noise a sheep might make, right? Why? I have no idea. It's nuts. But that's the way it is. Okay, so anything up here in blue or green is investment grade. Anything up here in blue or green is investment grade. Anything up here in blue or green is investment grade. Now, in yellow and red, we have our high yield or junk bonds. Now, the things match up right up until, by the way, C is the lowest one that they agree on, and then S&P has another rating called D. D is short for default. These bonds have already defaulted. Where are they in the Moody's side? Moody's still calls them a C. Moody's still calls them a C. Now, here is a question for you. Would you buy the bonds of a defaulted company? Yes. Why would you do it?
For growth opportunities.
Whoa. Swing and a miss.
Maybe I get paid for stock options.
Okay, you will, but these bonds are defaulted. Okay, let me start from a different direction. If you want to take over a healthy company, you need to buy up its stock. If you want to take over a sick company, you buy up the bonds and wait for it to die. And in fact, we call this vulture capitalism. You guys know what a vulture is? Yeah, it's a bird. What do they eat? Dead stuff. Over spring break, you decide to go out and visit, what's that desert in California where it gets really hot? Death Valley. You go decide to visit Death Valley. And as you're driving along, you're listening to your tunes and you don't realize that you're running out of gas. You're running out of gas, so you decide to walk for help. And you're walking along and you're not feeling so good. And then suddenly above you, you see vultures circling. What does that mean? Yeah, you're gonna die, right? And you say, wait a minute, I don't feel that bad. Who do you think has a better hold on whether you're gonna die or not? You or the vultures? The vultures. This is their job every day. This is your first game, right? Okay. Now, you wait for it to die, and then afterwards, who has the assets after the firm dies? You. Yeah, I do, right? Okay, so here, but this doesn't work for all sick companies. It's got to be a sick company that has been driven into the ground purely by stupid management. Purely by stupid management. If they've got a crap business model, it's not going to help. And I'll give you an example of each way. So do you guys remember when Hostess, the Twinkie company, went bankrupt? I told my wife, I said, they're not going to stay down long because I'm pretty sure that someone was out there buying up their bonds and they're going to get their hands on the assets and then they're going to start that thing back up. And sure enough, they did. And here's what they did. The old management, they had two different unions. One was a union for delivering snack cakes and the other was a union for delivering bread. They both are visiting the same stores every day. So there are always two Hostess trucks visiting every store. Does that sound efficient? No. They weren't investing in innovation. The Twinkie had been the same since before I was born, right? And yeah, it's never been good. There was no such thing as a chocolate Twinkie with a peanut butter filling. They weren't doing anything like that. They were doing all sorts of bad, stupid stuff. And so, when the new managers come in, the new owners come in, they put good managers in place. By the way, those union deals go away in bankruptcy. So the unions are like, we want to negotiate a new deal with you. And they're like, okay, here's what we're going to do. $10 an hour and only one truck. How many of the guys do you think stuck around? Yeah, so they get to start fresh without this. In fact, they may not even have a union today. I don't know. But long story short, are they successful now? Absolutely. Would this work with every model? No. I'll give you an example. Back when I was traveling for business back in the 90s, they had these in the back seat of the airplane, that pocket. There's the in-flight magazine, but there's also a catalog called Sky Mall. And Sky Mall, you get to looking at Sky Mall, and it was amazing the crap that you could find in Sky Mall. Now, the other thing you need to know is back then, we didn't have electronic devices, so if you had something to occupy yourself on the plane, it was probably a book. You probably finished it because your plane was late, and there you are. You've gone through the in-flight magazine, you've had a couple of drinks, and now you are halfway through Sky Mall, and you're feeling lonely. And by the way, you can call Michelle from Sky Mall free from the seatback phone. I don't know if you guys ever seen the seatback phones? Yeah, it was like 10 minutes. $10 a minute if you're going to call your mom, but you could call Michelle for free. And there you are, and you see Sasquatch, the statue of Sasquatch that have you seen that?
Yeah.
You can have that for your own very backyard. And you're like, hell yeah! Remember, you've had a couple of drinks. So you call Michelle at Sky Mall, and you order Sasquatch, and then you pass out. Now, 6 weeks later, your wife calls you, you're on the road, your wife calls you, and she says, a big crate just showed up today. You're like, well, what does it look like? She says, well, it's about 6 feet tall. You're like, oh, crap! It's Sasquatch. I did order a Sasquatch. Now, why is that business model no longer relevant? Number one, no seatback phones. Number two, people have electronic devices on airplanes. Number three, the airlines are throwing out those catalogs because they are weight, and weight is fuel, right? And so that's no longer a viable business model. Would you do vulture capitalism in Sky Mall? No. Absolutely not. We'll start here next time. Any questions? Yeah, go out and you could probably buy Sasquatch a lot cheaper today.
Yeah.